Briggs Cemetery is the final resting place of many of the early settlers of Ballstown, a community north of Schenectady. In 1775, Mary Gordon, recently emigrated from Ireland, was the first person buried in this cemetery. She was joined by many other residents of Middle Line Road, which is a few hundred yards to the west here. Among them were John Higbee, Edward Watrous, and George Scott. In the prime of their life, these men joined with others along Middle Line Road in defense of their new nation. "1780 was a hard year for the families of upstate New York. 3 years after the Battle of Saratoga, the war had degenerated into a bitter conflict among former friends. Frontier settlements were ravaged along the Mohawk Valley and the sparsely settled farms along the foothills of the Adirondacks and into the Green Mountain state of Vermont. Abandoned homes and ravaged farmlands was a common sight. Some were the farms of former neighbors who, choosing to side with the king's forces, had fled north to Canada. Some were destroyed when these same loyalists returned to their own neighborhoods, joined by their Iroquois allies to ravage the countryside of those who remained behind to defend their new nation. In 1778, numerous British-led raids were highlighted by the misnamed Wyoming Massacre on the New York-Pennsylvania border, when John Butler led a regiment of 200 Loyalist Rangers and a large group of Seneca and Cayuga warriors in an overwhelming victory over militia forces. Later that year, in another raid at Cherry Valley, the violence escalated, resulting in the murder of 30 civilians. Among the American forces who arrived soon after that massacre were elements of the 12th Albany County Militia, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Gordon of Ballston. In 1779, the American forces retaliated, sweeping through the Iroquois homeland, whose residents fled before the onslaught of the invasion, led by General John Sullivan and James Clinton, brother of Governor George Clinton. 1780 was to be the year of revenge. James Gordon, a native of Ireland, settled in Ballstown in 1772 after 15 years in America providing supplies to the British forces during the French and Indian War and engaging in trading ventures with the Iroquois. He was the largest landowner along Middle Line Road in Ballstown and quickly became the leader among the newly arriving settlers. When war broke out in 1775, he joined the American forces and was appointed lieutenant colonel of the 12th Regiment of the Albany County Militia. In the early years of the war, his militiamen were often assigned to round up their local neighbors who retained allegiance to the crown, many of which fled to Canada to join the British cause as loyalists. One of those neighbors was William Fraser. In 1780, now Captain William Fraser returned to Ballstown as second in command and scout for a party of 200 invaders, including elements of the King's Royal Regiment, loyal Indians, and a company of Fraser's own Rangers. Leader of the force was Captain John Monroe. Monroe began his military career as an officer in the 48th Regiment of Foot during the French and Indian War. After the war, he became a merchant and large landowner bordering the future state of Vermont. He became a justice of the peace and had several run-ins with Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys. As prominent citizens of Albany County, Monroe and Gordon knew each other well, but went their separate ways when war broke out. 1780, the year of revenge, began in earnest in May, when a force of 500 men, under the command of Sir John Johnson, raided Johnstown, named after John's father, Sir William Johnson. Raids continued throughout the summer, but the major action was to occur in the fall. Sir John returned in a campaign that laid waste to settlements in the Schoharie and Mohawk valleys. In concert with this invasion, Major Christopher Carleton moved south along Lake Champlain with a force of 970 men. On October 7th, Monroe's 200 men detached at Bulwaga Bay near Crown Point and headed southwest to bring more destruction to the American settlements. After a 4-day march, they entered the Ballston district comprised of the western half of today's Saratoga County. Moving through friendly Loyalist farmlands, they avoided detection by the local militia who were distracted by Carleton, who had moved south, capturing Fort George with considerable loss of life among its defenders. With Carleton on the move back towards Canada, Monroe decided to turn his attention to Gordon and his militiamen along Middle Line Road. Approaching the sleeping settlement on the evening of October 16th, relationships between the former friends and acquaintances would be severely tested under the scourge of war. Toward the end of that conflict, they were unwilling participants in an event that would change their lives forever.
The major target of the raid was the officers along the midline of the 12th Albany County Militia, Lieutenant Colonel James Gordon being the top prize. As his house was being burned and ransacked and he was taken prisoner, he was standing in the pre-dawn cold, shivering, waiting to be shuffled along with the rest of the prisoners. Most of his clothes had been either looted or burned previously. Noting his distress and wanting to make sure that his cargo was being delivered to the Crown in good shape, Lieutenant Langdon of the King's Royal Regiment of New York reached into his own knapsack and pulled out his blanket coat, giving it to Gordon. This would obviously give Gordon some relief against the cold and the trek he would have to take for the next 3 days for the destination of Crown Point.
The only casualty of the raid along the midline was one Isaac Stowe. Stowe happened to be the nephew of Captain Collins and the miller of Colonel Gordon. As he was shoved in the darkness amongst the other prisoners, he did not see Colonel Gordon's face. He made a desperate attempt to run to Gordon's house to warn him of the raid and thus saving him. Unfortunately for Stowe, one of the Mohawks had a pike and thrust it through his back, killing him.
War, violence, hatred. They have a lot to do with what was going on in Ballston in 1780. But you know, sometimes, even in the midst of war and conflict, there's something bright and shining and good that comes out of it. Let's look at the case of George Scott and what happened to him. George lived on Middle Line Road. He lived there for quite some time. And he was asleep on the night the British invaded Ballston, just like everybody else was. But he heard commotion. Now, did he hear noise outside? Did he see flames from some of his neighbors' houses? Maybe. Or, most likely, he heard his dog barking. And that really woke him up and realized something's going on, and I need to see what it is, and I need to deal with it. So, Scott gets out of bed, walks over to his door, picks up his weapon, opens his door, and maybe walks outside, where he is confronted with a whole lot of British and Indians. I'm sure he's shocked, amazed, surprised. But suddenly, one of the British men, a man named Fraser, William Fraser, shouts out to Scott because they knew each other. They had lived nearby at one time. So Fraser shouts out, Put your weapon down. If you don't, they're going to kill you. But before Scott can even think about putting his weapon down, or anybody can respond to that request, the Indians launched their attack with tomahawks. One of the tomahawks made its mark, right in Scott's head. Most likely, Scott fell to the ground. He was probably in a lot of pain. And just as they're about to scalp him, another man comes on the scene, a guy named Springsteen. Not the Springsteen you know from music, but another Springsteen. Well, he too knew Scott. He had worked for Scott in the past, so they mutually knew each other as well. And he stops the Indians from scalping him. Scott is left, probably on the ground, with his wife tending to him, and probably with the expectation that he's going to die. His children reappear on the scene. They are all safe. Scott does survive. He survives for 5 more years. But the reality, isn't it amazing that even in a time of war and violence and hatred, that 2 men who happen to know Scott come to his rescue. 2 men who are on the opposite sides. Truly amazing.
For one group of Middle Line residents, the raid was especially alarming. 4 enslaved individuals, Nero, Anne, Jacob, and Liz, lived at Lieutenant Colonel Gordon's home. As the raiding party swept through the area, Liz managed to escape into the fields and remained hidden until the night's hostilities had ended. One account says that she used a strip of fabric torn from her petticoat to tie around the muzzle of a dog to prevent it from barking and betraying her location. Nero, Anne, and Jacob were captured and forced to march northward to Canada. As captives, once they reached Montreal, Nero, Anne, and Jacob were sold. Nero managed to escape at least twice and headed back southward into New York and then Massachusetts. He eventually returned to Ballston and, according to some accounts, was granted his freedom from Gordon in the early 19th century. When remembering the experiences of those who were captured by the raiders, we should pause and take a moment to think about what Nero, Anne, Jacob, and Liz must have felt. Liz, her fear of being discovered while hiding in the field and witnessing the destruction that surrounded her. The feelings of Jacob and Anne on their long journey and at the prospect of being sold in a foreign land. And the experiences of Nero, his captivity, sale, and 2 escapes into the wilderness. Their stories deserve to be remembered and their experiences honored. While the women and children of the Middle Line settlement were not the target of the raid, they certainly endured the consequences of the event. They witnessed their husbands, fathers, brothers, and neighbors taken captive and marched off into the wilderness. Many likely assumed that this would be the last time they ever laid eyes upon their loved ones. These families also lost nearly all of their homes and possessions through pillaging and fires. They survived and persevered through the kindness of more distant neighbors and relations. One of the few homes that was not burned was saved through the efforts of a woman known as Granny Leak. The raiders tossed a lit length of cordage into the home with the intent to set it alight. Granny sprung into action and swept the burning cord out the door, saving her home. While the raid certainly made an impression on everyone who witnessed it, One of the most detailed accounts comes from Colonel Gordon's daughter, Melinda, who was a young child at the time. She wrote down her memories as well as the experiences that her father shared after his return. It is through Melinda that we have the story of the mercy shown to her father through the offering of a warm coat. She even preserved some of the feelings of the raiders through a quote that her father had overheard on the journey northward. According to Gordon, an older soldier from a British regiment stated his distaste for the massacres, close fighting, and effects upon the civilians, stating,
"I have been through all the wars in Europe and in a great many battles, but I have never before heard of such bloody orders as these. I can kill in the heat of battle, but cannot be made to murder in cold blood."
Everyone knew that if an escape was discovered or a rescue mission attempted, one potential command was to kill all of the prisoners. While the soldiers on the raid were not forced to act upon this, the threat of possible violence loomed. Mercifully, Captain John Monroe's later actions showed a humanitarian regard for his prisoners, and the group made its way northward, largely without incident.
As dawn brightened the eastern sky on the morning of October 17th, the raiders, their 30 prisoners, along with their livestock, stopped briefly here to regroup for the trek back north to Canada. The captives were lined up in single file with a British or Indian guard front and back. As they ascended the high ground toward Lake Desolation, 4 men could not keep up due to age or injuries. Captain Monroe released them to return to their settlements with a message warning the local militia not to try to follow the raiders. No reprisals were attempted, and the party, weakened by fatigue and hunger, reunited with Carleton's force at Crown Point on October 24th and arrived back in Montreal on November 1st. The militiamen were dispatched to prison barracks, while officers were held under house arrest in private homes. The enslaved captives were sold to Montreal merchants. Over the next 2 years, several of the militiamen escaped, including their leader, James Gordon, who survived a harrowing trek through the wilderness of Maine to safety. Men still in prison were released 2 years later when the war ended. Some returned to Middle Line Road to begin life anew. Others returned to their old family homes in New England. Both of the leading men in the raid went on to serve their new countries in their new world. John Monroe settled in Canada, became a leader in the community, and served in the Legislative Council of Upper Canada. James Gordon returned home, entertained George Washington during his visit to upstate New York in 1783, and served 2 terms in Congress in the 1790s. His captured slave Nero returned home and was eventually freed. In the years after the end of hostilities, the town of Ballston welcomed many new settlers that built their lives on the lands that once faced the horror of war, but also the humanity of those caught up in the conflict.